Okay, hi everyone. Really glad to be back. The last time I was here, I think I'd only just left the civil service to return to the private sector. Boo. But at the time, conversations about conversations about government data infrastructure were really immature. They were really nascent. There was a buzz about data because, I mean, obviously data is great, something must be done with it, therefore this is something kind of conversations. But it wasn't yet grounded in our practice. And that's always concerning because when you don't ground the buzz in process and real stuff, then it kind of fizzles out and nothing really comes of it. But, you know, it feels like a lot has changed in a year because I'm back now and, I'm in the building. I'm not back in government. I'm in the building. But because I stalk the GDS Twitter timeline, I know that analytics has since been kind of tied into the serve design community, and I think that's really great because this is the kind of anchoring that I think means that we end up with infrastructure that is about more than talk. Okay, so in the last 2 or 3 years, I've been in roles that have meant that I've been doing a lot of thinking about the type of infrastructure we're building. And that's led me to think about, you know, the sort of people who are involved in the building of infrastructure, and also the environment in which we're doing this building. What I've liked about the talks that have preceded mine has been the focus or the really holistic way that people are thinking about infrastructure building, thinking about the economics that's driving this stuff, thinking about the people who are working in them, thinking about the environment in which we do the building, because all of these things affect the infrastructure that we end up with. And this is by no means unique. I think anyone who works in tech, anyone with a soul who works in tech has been somewhat distressed about some of the ways that the technology that we've built is being used. I think sometimes somewhat naively. You know, I'm just only whinge of the evening. It's when people who've worked with organizations that you think, well, how did you think your organization was making money? A lot of times you get people who kind of say like, oh, you know, you should know if it's free, you're the product. And we say that about the user, but less so about the organization itself. So when people kind of go, oh my goodness, who could have foreseen this? Anyway, okay, whinge over. But yeah, I've been thinking about some of these things. And in particular, as I said, I've been thinking about the environment, and I've been thinking about technological utopianism. I've been thinking about agile delivery processes, and a focus on the happy path, which is one of the things that, again, just thinking about the environment in which we build infrastructure, I think has had a significant impact on the shape of the infrastructure we've built. I think, yeah. So, on the people front, I've been thinking about the sort of people who are drawn to working in technology, or who make it through the gates, who are allowed to work in this space. And I have a working hypothesis, and it's that generally technologists are more optimistic than the wider population, right? This is one of the challenges with speaking to an audience where you know people, because as I said that, Rory whispered something. That's Rory, everyone look at him. He whispered something. And the effects of that is, I just know that he's talking about my pessimistic outlook. I feel like that's what he's talking about. But that's not true. Like, I've made it into tech. I too am an optimist. Yeah, so I haven't worked out a rigorous way of testing this hypothesis, but I feel in the interest of transparency, I should declare that this is a working assumption. That for the most part, we are overly optimistic about tech. Right, so while I'm up here just kind of declaring assumptions, I should also declare a few more. I think we tend to be quite technocratic, and I think this creates certain blind spots. Interestingly, I think this is a characteristic that we share, as in people who work in technology, share with civil servants. I think when we have disagreements with our fellow civil servants, I say our fellow, I don't work in government anymore. When I worked in government and there were disagreements with other civil servants, I think looking back, what we were really disagreeing about were the technocratic solutions we were going to apply, rather than a fundamentally different way of looking at things. I think technocrats, regardless of which discipline they're working in, tend to look at a problem through a very specific technical discipline lens. And I think that creates blind spots. And I think what that means is that very often we miss the economic, social power dynamics at play in the human interactions. And everything we're building, all this infrastructure, is to facilitate human interactions, right? Okay, so essentially, I think there are loads of things that can trip us up in terms of building infrastructure well. And so all of this is building up to my justification for what might seem, right, like a pessimistic talk, but really is not. It really isn't. But I think there is more value to looking at failures in infrastructure building, because I think, given my assumption that we are for the most part overly optimistic, that we can learn a lot more from traditional physical infrastructure building about what could go wrong, and maybe learn from that. So, because if we don't, the outcome is really brittle infrastructure. It's not sustainable, it doesn't stand up, and there's real impact to that. Okay, so like I said, this is not the cheeriest start to the talk, but it's not a pessimistic talk. I'm going for balanced and hopeful, and we'll get there, you'll see. Okay, like I said, I think there's a lot we can learn from those who build and design physical infrastructure, and there are opportunities for us to piggyback on some of the things, some of the painfully learned lessons. Okay, so what are some of these lessons? I'm going to cite one example and just kind of look at three lessons from that particular example. I'm going to kind of focus on the economic, social, and power dynamics at play in this example. Okay, does anyone recognize that map? Yeah, Rory. Anybody else recognize the map? So, yeah. Okay, so it is the map of the New York metro system. Can I just say, I love New York. It's one of my favorite cities. But this map, it's almost sadistic. It's actually really hard to navigate. I don't say that as a diss to New York. I love New York. I just don't get this map. Anyway, that's not what this is about, though. December 16th, 1940. Does anyone know? I would love it if someone knew why that date was significant. No one will think you're sad. You're in the right audience to know really obscure stuff like this. Anyone? Okay, no. There is no reason you should, really. But it was the date of the last metro station. The last metro station that was added to the line was December 16th, 1940. There has been so little infrastructure building on the New York metro since that date. Now, this is just crazy, right? Is it not? Am I, doesn't everyone know? Okay. I think...
5 new stations in the last 2 years.
Oh, okay. Where? No, seriously, because this is So I've heard that they were...
The 7 line going west from...
I've heard, right. So is this one of those...
The U line is extending L on 2nd Avenue.
Okay, is this a real... Okay, I don't want to get into the debate about it.
Really.
But are they real stations or extensions? Because I've heard that there have been minor extensions, but they don't count as proper new stations.
No, they're the nicest stations we have.
Really? In the last 2 years? Okay, so, sorry, what's your name?
I'm Devin.
Devin? Yeah. So Devin has ruined this now. But, so let's just say, from 1940 till about 2 years ago, thank you, Devin, it's too late, Devin, you can't step back from what you've done, you've ruined this talk. But, so from 1940 till 2 years ago when according to Devon, the metro has since had 5 new stations. There's been a significant length of time with no building. Right, Devon?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, okay. So I thought it'd be really interesting to just look at why this was the case. And this extensive report that didn't cover the last 2 years, obviously, kind of touched on 3 main things. I should just say, I think it's really crazy given not just the massive population increase in the population of New York, but also the fact that through the 1940s, the 1930s, 1940s, there was a huge infrastructure boom, investment in public infrastructure within, just across the United States anyway. So it seems particularly weird that this would be happening. But there are apparently 3 contributing factors. The first was around the lure of the suburbs. The second, delivery partner challenges. And the third, the growing cost of technical debt. And I think anyone who works in the building of digital data infrastructure will recognize these sorts of problems, right? Well, not the lure of the suburbs, but I will cite a clever parallel, right? And it will all make sense. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of kind of how these things kind of created a perfect storm that resulted in no new stations until the last 2 years. Okay. The first layer of the suburbs. Now, again, this is a really interesting thing about how investment starts to shape people's behavior. So a lot of the investment, public infrastructure investment, was in roads because a newly affluent middle class were buying these new mass-produced cars, and this was very much the symbol of the good life, the symbol of prosperity, the symbol of what it meant to be living the American dream. And what it meant was people started leaving, wealthier, middle class, aspiring, the strivers started leaving cities and moving out into the suburbs. And government infrastructure spending was facilitating that by building all these roads. Delivery partners. So at the time when the metro was first opened, it was an amazing sort of PPI scheme that kind of facilitated this. And they had this system of 2 main suppliers who ran the infrastructure, and government received a certain proportion as a return on investment. Almost immediately there was a falling out. So many of the legislators were displeased with the return on investment, but they were also concerned about how decisions were being made about the extension of the metro system. What it ended up being was a real sort of power tussle between private and public power brokers, essentially. And this is a good lesson. If you ever really go up against government, if government is really determined, you will lose. Essentially, what the New York legislature did was to impose a series of legislative barriers that meant they pretty much economically crippled those 2 suppliers, right? Now, this was amazingly short-sighted when you think about it, but the nature of those who held public office meant they would never be in office to really reap the rewards of these legislative decisions. So these 2 companies kind of went out of business, essentially, and it got to the point, actually around the time that this last station was added, where the municipal government could buy back the franchise for running this stuff. Now, they managed to buy it back, but again, because these 2 delivery partners had been pretty much economically crippled, there'd been no maintenance going on for most of the time they've been running them. Not only that, because the legislature had placed a cap on fares, it meant that people were used to paying really, really low fares. So by the time the government took over running the infrastructure again, people were paying less. So around the 1940s, when the government took over again, people were paying less in real terms than they had been in the 20s and 30s. It's just amazing. So anyway, they got it. And they got it back, it moved back into public control at just the time that the move to the suburbs, the mass exodus from cities was happening, which meant they had fewer people riding the metro anyway. But more than that, it also meant they had to raise fares at a time of fewer passengers. And even though the plan was then to continue to grow out and build out the metro system, what ended up happening was that any new revenue was fully absorbed by trying to address the technical debt that had built up over time. Okay. Right. So here's my brilliant parallel with regards to the lure of the suburbs. It really is about infrastructure commons. Right, and I think in government we recognise this because we, in the UK, have within the national government a very, very federated system. And without an understanding or an investment in the commons, what essentially happens is people stop investing in it. And the lack of investment or the shape of investment starts to shape the infrastructure we get. Okay, and I think this is important if we're in the business of building sustainable infrastructure. So I will cite an example from my time in government and conversations I have with people working in departments I think is really important. And it's our funding model. Now, if you've ever had to do a business case in government, then you will know that for all sorts of reasons, and not even stupid reasons. That's what makes this so frustrating. I loved some of the conversations, in the talks earlier, people cited the fact that everyone kind of knew that this was the right thing to do, and either people didn't have the data, or there weren't the economic models that allowed the more sensible thing to be done. And that's we see that kind of behavior in government too. So if you've ever done a business case, then you will know that generally there's a preference for reasons of accountability. So these aren't stupid reasons. But Treasury generally prefers that it's a single department. So what you tend to find is that you don't get projects that have a business case that run across several departments, right? Every department will usually make their own business case for a program by themselves. And that makes it easier to track and it's more accountable. But it does have an impact if we're trying to build infrastructure commons. Similarly, Treasury has a preference for funding programs of work, right? Rather than infrastructure as a standalone thing. Again, that shapes the things that we then end up building. Because you're only going to get funding for programs of work, then you might as well go off and build a new service. And if there isn't a sustainable commons infrastructure, then you're going to have to build your infrastructure as you go. And you never have to worry about whether anyone else can reuse your infrastructure, because that's not the basis on which your business case is going to be assessed. And while it's easy to point fingers at Treasury, because almost certainly no one from Treasury is here, so it's easy to do, I think there are lessons that we can kind of look at, even aside from the money, about our culture, right? Our culture in government. I think code reuse in government is still relatively poor, right? I think that's true. And I think data reuse is even further behind. So the idea of reusing data, reusing code, and if you think of how long we've been going through this process of digital transformation, our reuse of code should be far, far better than it is now, and yet it isn't. And I see all sorts of, again, kind of tying this back to the governance and policy around some of this stuff, I see all sorts of attempts to change the practice that don't really touch on the problem. And now you should take everything I say at this point with a pinch of salt. I work in the private sector, and I work for an organization that does sell proprietary software. Boo. One of the things, now that I'm on the outside, I've noticed is the emphasis on open source code, to the point that actually if you're looking to supply government, one of the things that we have had to look at, or rather our lawyers have had to look at, is signing away rights to proprietary software. Now, I get the idea behind it. The idea behind this is that if the code is open source, then of course it will facilitate reuse and everyone will reuse it. Now, again, I'm going to draw a parallel with the situation with the metro, the beautiful metro of that great city, New York, where inadvertently the legislature put in place policies and governance that just put their delivery partners out of business, but also created real problems for them. So I want to say, as a supplier who is trying to sell stuff to government, so again, take everything I'm saying with a pinch of salt, but I really do think that the insistence on open source as the only approach isn't the only approach, right? I don't think this is the only way to make things work. And I don't think it's working. I don't think we've seen the kind of code reuse that we thought we would this far into digital transformation. So, but like I said, I'm also trying to sell stuff, so. Okay. Right. And this is one of the other things, again, just on culture. So it's not just about the money, it's not just about the funding models, it's also about the culture. And infrastructure shapes culture even as culture shapes infrastructure. Did I say? Culture shapes infrastructure even as infrastructure shapes culture. Yeah, so I said. Okay. So if you think about it, has anyone, if you're one of the few departments who's really out there, far ahead, and you're building stuff, you're building data models, how many people building data models can think of a data model that they have reused that was built by another part of government? No. I'm pausing for dramatic effect. I really don't think anyone's going to go, yeah, me. I just want the silence to really make us think about it. And I would argue that actually a lot of this is because of the way our infrastructure is designed. So that point I was making earlier about the environment in which we are doing the building shapes our behavior, right? We aren't designed, we don't have processes, we don't have governance structures. We most certainly, I keep saying we, I don't work in government, but I'm going to slip back and forth, so. Yeah, okay, yeah, it's practically the same thing, like we're family. Yeah, exactly. So we, the collective we the people. Do you like that, Devon? That's an American thing, like we the people? Okay. We certainly don't have infrastructure that facilitates this, right? A situation where we could be using the same data, where we could train our models on data that's standardized, where the tools we're using, whatever they may be, whatever analytic tools you like, can be standardized, where we can test one another's models, where we can train one another's models, where we can never mind consume and reuse them. We just don't have the infrastructure that enables this kind of behavior. I'm going to skip these slides, but please ask me questions about them later. Okay. Again, so the slide I showed you earlier is kind of like, this is fairly far out in the future, I think. Very, very few organizations actually have anything like this. I usually just show the slide so that people feel bad about where they are infrastructure-wise. But this is a reality, right? And I think it's really important, again, just thinking about the way that our tools shape our behavior, that many of these traditional productivity tools were designed for highly individualized, highly localized ways of working, not collaborative ways of working at all. We can't be using these tools and expect to see this idea of infrastructure as commons, right? Our tools actively blind us to working in that way. And then that brings us very neatly to this issue of paying down technical debt. And I would argue that, again, we have a culture, as some of the other speakers have kind of touched on, but especially Simon, that prefers the privileges rebuilding, right, from scratch. And what it means is there is a huge technical debt. And now some of that stuff we can't do anything about, right? Like, it was before our time. But I think it's worth considering how our culture today, working in digital, in data, in government today, still privileges building completely new things as opposed to reusing anything. And that we're not going to get away from paying down this technical debt. It just slows us down. We're not going to get away with it. And yet, if you think of how many business cases you've written, or when you're making presentations to senior leadership, how many times do we ever in our presentations include anything about paying down technical debt? I would argue very few of us do. I know that when I worked in government, it was generally the bit that I put at the end because it wasn't cool, it wasn't sexy, and I was unlikely to get my funding. And so instead, sorry, my old boss is sitting right there. I didn't do this to you, Paul. I only did that to other senior people. But what it did mean was that we then had to try and find ways of building infrastructure or maintaining infrastructure by stealth, right? And the truth is, it doesn't work. We have too big a problem with regards to our technical debt to try for building or fixing by stealth to really, really work. Okay. It starts to get more like optimistic in a little while. Don't worry. Okay. So what are some of the things that we can start to do? I think we definitely need to start looking more seriously about building links between design and policy using data. Now, for as long as I've worked in government, when I worked in government, this has been a dream. And I've never seen it really come to fruition. And yet, I really don't see a way around it. I don't think we can have infrastructure as a commons if we don't have a wide base of users. And I still think, unfortunately, that much of policy is made in a vacuum, still. Definitely an evidence-free vacuum. But good data is one of the ways that we start to shine a light on this. But very often, we don't have the data. And that's not a policy problem, or rather, that's not a policy-created problem. It's a digital data technology people created problem. We just don't collect data because we don't value it, we don't prioritize its collection. And then what it means is when there are gaps, we're not able to provide the data that means you can then answer that problem, right? So I know that all the time I worked in government, whenever we made the argument for building up infrastructure, someone would say, usually Treasury, how do we know? How do we know it's going to generate any of the value you say it will? And we never had the data because no one collects it. Right, and part of that is because we don't take it seriously enough to incorporate any of these sorts of things, data discovery, data collection, metadata, all the things that make for good quality data are not embedded in our everyday practices, right? We don't focus on this in the way that we do when we're like any of the other good practice that we see for good design, I would argue. Now, I cite this example because this made the news very recently, and I thought it was really amazing. Again, it's to the point of where is the data? If you don't have the data, if there's a data gap, it might as well not be a thing, right? And this tweet relates to the really tragic issue of the number of people who have died while homeless. No one was collecting that data. It wasn't until the end of this investigative piece of journalism that the ONS then said, well, we'll start compiling this data, we'll start collecting it. Now, the reason I cite this example is because I think I thought it was a good opportunity to kind of think a little bit about the ethics of data collection. Now, there are good reasons around cost and so on for why we don't collect everything. No one can collect everything. The idea that data represents us perfectly is just a lie. And yet, we must collect some data. We need to be able to gather enough data for things like data analytics. Having said that, there are real issues about indiscriminate data gathering. And there is also power dynamics in play with regards to what data gets collected and what data doesn't. I would argue it is not by accident no one was collecting this data. There are certain data sets that, if you're thinking about it, can only embarrass you. And there are political, well, I don't mean political, capital P political. There are power dynamics that mean that certain data sets aren't collected. There's an excellent piece of work that I just want to give a shout out to, because I think these are important issues that we are going to have to be thinking about if we're building sustainable data infrastructure. And it's by an artist and designer called Mimi Onuoha. And she did this piece of work. It's called The Library of Missing Datasets. But if you take a picture of this and Google this talk was amazing. And she basically talks about the power dynamics at play and how we do this sort of thing responsibly, because we do have to collect this data. But how do we do it responsibly? Okay. Standardizing and rewarding data reuse, both on the supply and demand side. There are no penalties, and I don't mean like financial ones, but there is no disincentive to not doing this if you work in government. So if you're building a service in government and you try and get through the service standard assessment, you will not fail because you have not reused data. You won't be asked if you've reused data. You won't be asked how your data can be made available for other people to use. We just don't do it. Again, I'm going to just touch on one more time the issue with tools. I have a real bugbear about our over-dependence on Google Analytics as the lens through which we look at data and analytics. And I think it's because the focus is too narrow. It forces us to look at these things primarily as the users transition through the digital service. So we don't think about how our service fits into a wider data ecosystem. It certainly doesn't expose us to data reuse in any sort of way. I think it's really damaging. Not Google Analytics in itself. I don't have an issue with the tool itself. I have an issue with our overdependence on it in governments and the way it blinds us. And then also just raising the good enough data quality, right? So often in our building and designing of services, we are only thinking about the service that we are trying to get through the service standard right now. And the impacts of that is that our threshold for good enough data quality is really, really low, right? As long as we've captured enough data to get people through the digital aspect of the service, that's pretty much all that we think about in the service design stage. And I think that really has to change. And the reason we think it's good enough is because we're not thinking about anybody reusing that data. And yet, services are the data engine of governments, right? If you think about the way that most people interact with government on a day-to-day basis, it's through services, through services, many of which are digital and increasingly so. So this is the engine for data generation. And yet, we never think about data capture, data collection, or the data quality. And then the point I've already made about the need for this to be a very broad base of users. One of my favorite government tools is something called Churchill, which was built by DWP. And what I love about it is it's a digital and data exemplar that is used almost exclusively by policy people. And I think that really matters. I think it's really important that everyone is bought in. That point about the fragmentation and people not being invested in the commons, this is how we start to fix it. Okay, last point, and it's about the stories we tell. It's about what we're emphasizing, what we're celebrating. Before this talk, I did a quick review of the GDS blog, and I couldn't find a single blog post celebrating reuse of data or reuse of infrastructure. Okay, but reasons for hope, yay! Okay, so I think we are waking up to the brittleness of infrastructure and the fact that we are building infrastructure as we go. I think we take it a lot more seriously, and increasingly so. I think that we've been here before. Many of the problems that we're facing now with data, we experience with digital transformation as well. So I think there are lessons that we can learn from what made that a difficult journey, and we can leverage some of that. And then last but not least, I think communities like this, this is an awfully obvious, ingratiating way to end the talk, to just go, oh, invite me back, please. I won't be such a downer next time. Is that I think communities like this are really, really important if we are building a commons, because we need to start normalizing certain behaviors that encourage maintenance and reuse. Thank you.